Barely a day goes by without bribery and corruption being in the news, especially now in the UK, with the new Bribery Act about to come into force on July the 1st. But the global picture includes governments, business, civil society organisations and many others. Just last week, India's former telecoms minister was charged with allegations of corruption regarding the sale of mobile phone licences. So today we're exploring bribery and corruption on the world stage and looking at the mechanisms whereby it can be detected, combated, prosecuted and, probably most important of all, prevented. And with me to share their opinions and expertise are Steve Zimmerman. He's the World Bank Director of Operations for the Integrity Vice Presidency. Mariam Kennedy, Ernst & Young's Lead Forensic Partner for the International Development Sector, and Arpinder Singh, Ernst & Young's Head of Forensic Practice in India. So Steve, if I can begin with you, a little bit of context. Tell me about the World Bank and about multilateral development banks.
Sure, thank you, Mark. The role of the World Bank is to lend money to developing countries specifically for programs to fight poverty. We lend in over 100 countries around the world for a variety of different projects, building schools, roads, and hospitals. Obviously, we lend in very difficult environments where corruption is often a significant problem. About 10 or 12 years ago, the World Bank really undertook a program to try and tackle corruption in parallel with its development agenda. One of the first steps it took was to create my office, what is now called the Integrity Vice Presidency, and charge it with the detection, investigation, and sanctioning of fraud and corruption in bank finance projects. We have also created our own internal sanctions program, a sanctions system where, after an investigation by my office, a firm or an individual can be sanctioned. They can be declared ineligible from participating in a bank finance project for having engaged in fraud or corruption. It actually has a very significant impact and can be have a significant economic cost on businesses that engage in such conduct. What also important is prevention. The bank takes prevention very seriously. As you always say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But in our program, what we will do is focus strongly on what happens to the company on the other end of the sanction. How can we ensure that they've put in place a compliance program to ensure that the conduct that led to their sanction in the first instance won't reoccur, and that these companies will be able to engage in World Bank finance projects with minimal risk of corruption?
Broadly speaking, I mean, do you find that governments care enough about corruption and how to tackle it?
Yeah, I think governments care. I think it's a challenge at times to both tackle the development agenda while also tackling corruption. When you get to its core, it's a very difficult problem. Even in the United Kingdom, the United States, we still have an evolving anti-corruption agenda, as you can see from the new statute here in the United Kingdom. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is really not that old a statute. So it's a new problem. It's an old problem with new solutions, I should say. So yes, I think the governments take it seriously. I think some governments all around the world are more successful than others, but the World Bank stands ready to help those governments however is necessary. Our sanction system and our investigative mechanisms really do exist to some extent in parallel with the efforts of the government. But one thing we always do is at the end of an investigation, or whenever the bank finds a problem with fraud or corruption in a project, we'll not only use those findings to impose sanctions ourselves, but we will also share those findings. We share those findings first with other multilateral development banks, and we've now instituted a program of cross-debarment, where if you are sanctioned by the World Bank, you would also be sanctioned by the other leading multilateral development banks around the world. But we also share our findings with governments and encourage the governments to take their own actions. And to be clear, the bank's findings by my office and through our sanction systems are not a finding of a violation of the laws of a member country, member of the bank, but rather a finding of our own anti-corruption policy. We leave it up to the individual country to determine whether or not their laws have been violated and stand ready to work with those countries to assist them in their own investigations and their own prosecutions if they choose to take it that far.
Do you think that the stamping out of corruption globally, is that a realistic hope? I mean, will there be some spread of best practice across the planet that will achieve that goal?
Well, I have to believe it's a realistic hope, since spent much of my life striving for it. I think it's a hope. How quickly we'll get there, I don't know. I don't plan to retire for a number of years, so a few more years still. But I think we've made a lot of progress. In some countries more than others. There's still a long way to go. But I think there is a growing recognition of how significant the problem of corruption is to economic development. And whether you sit on the private side or on the public side, there's generally a desire to see economic development. You may be motivated by different things, but you have a singular goal. And corruption simply is a cost that makes that more difficult. It makes it more difficult for a company to do business profitably. It makes it more difficult for a government to operate effectively, and ultimately, I think, to win votes. So I think we have a shared goal. It's a tough fight. But I think it's one now that the World Bank has clearly recognized is critical to its own public development agenda, and that goal is shared by many governments.
On a practical note, I mean, how would your Vice Presidency for Integrity, how would you receive an allegation, and what would you do with it?
Well, we have the traditional whistleblower mechanisms. We set up a number of channels for individuals to contact us and encourage people to contact us. One can contact us through the World Bank website, through toll-free numbers. We've set up a phone system that can be accessed from throughout the world, and there's information on our website that would tell you how to access that. We accept anonymous allegations. We will always keep allegations confidential, really in an effort to encourage people in very difficult environments to contact us, because we understand that there can sometimes be a cost and indeed a risk to individuals coming forward in many of the countries where we do business. Once we receive those allegations, they go through an initial vetting process. We actually receive thousands of communications a month, and that's funneled down to a much smaller number of matters that we actually investigate. First of all, we only investigate matters that relate to a World Bank financed project, not simply in a country that receives World Bank financing, which is a point sometimes of some confusion. And then we will identify the allegations that really are those that merit investigation. We have a triaging mechanism to identify those allegations. I then have a team of investigators that work with me that are comprised of people with a forensic background, such as my colleagues here from E&Y, former prosecutors, former law enforcement, and those individuals form investigative teams that are organized for geographic regions around the world, and they'll spend a lot of time in a variety of locations around the world conducting those investigations. If in those cases where we substantiate the findings of fraud or corruption, it moves on to our legal team, and we have a special litigation unit that then prepares and presents the case in our internal judicial system to determine whether or not to impose sanction. So it's a fairly well-developed process now, a very thorough process, and at the end of which sanctions might be imposed, cross-debarment might be imposed, and then ultimately referral would be made. And then finally, we have an integrity compliance officer who then works with the companies that have been sanctioned to ensure that they've put in place an adequate compliance program. More recently, we have started a mechanism to resolve cases through a settlement, or what we call a negotiated resolution. Somewhere in between a plea bargain and a civil settlement, because the process is really more of an administrative process. And this is a mechanism where a firm can acknowledge what's occurred, seek a resolution that would be far more favorable than it might be were they to see it through, and accept the fact that they will need to work with the World Bank to put in place an integrity program in order to bring themselves off the debarment list. But it's a far more efficient way, both for the bank, for the company, and ultimately for the citizens of the country, to ensure that we move the projects forward.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Because, of course, the thing about, I suppose, these issues is we forget sometimes there is an incredible human cost, isn't there? You know, for example, it was alleged that in Haiti, half the buildings collapsed because they'd been built, in one sense, in a corrupt context.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, I'm curious to ask Mariam that in this country, as the Bribery Act guidance has just been issued, you know, you've heard voices say, well, actually, it's a barrier to business. It's more red tape. It's getting in the way of business, especially now when times are tough. Yeah. But I wonder, from your perspective, do businesses care about corruption? Should they care about corruption?
Well, I think yes, they should, because we'll come back to the point that you actually wanted to pick up on, the point that you were asking Steve, which is how far are we with eradicating corruption altogether? I think the point is, I want to pick up on Steve's point, we have come a long way. You don't really have to go very far back to a time where bribes paid overseas were counted as legitimate business expenses. You deducted off your profits before you paid tax. You only go far back as the late 90s when that was the case. Now I think we're in a position that in most countries and for most multinationals, the rules and regulations are on the books, and the policies have been written. And the key question now is about enforcement and implementation. And the next question is, how do you make this practical? How do you actually identify where there are problems? And I think, again, the key point is having enough transparency around the transactions and the money flows so that you can identify and you can hold individuals and governments and organizations to account in relation to their activities, in relation to implementation. And those are the conversations that we're having now at government level and also with multinationals, because actually they're facing some similar challenges. You know, the turnover of some of the multinationals is similar to GDP of some countries. So what the questions that they're asking is, what is it that we can practically do from a financial management perspective to highlight those areas that we should prioritize for scrutiny?
And what are the answers?
So on that theme of being practical about it, we've got a very sort of principles-based approach to this, which is in helping to focus on the key areas. If you look at any area where there is lack of transparency, there's lack of accountability, and there's opportunity for personal gain, those are the breeding grounds for corruption. This is not a matter of national cultural characteristics. You put those circumstances in the UK, in France, in Africa, you get the same results, as we saw, for example, with the expenses scandal in the UK. So what do we do practically? And I brought a couple of examples to demonstrate this. And I'm going to flip on to one of the first examples. And this is an example of a government that we're working with. And this is a government which is receiving funding from multilateral banks. And in conjunction with the multilateral, they wanted to increase transparency over their budget because they're getting budget support funding. So the question that we're asking was, why is it that as a government we have a budget that's approved by our parliament, but our expenditure doesn't accord with what was agreed? And it's and one of the first concerns is, where is it that we might be losing public funds through maybe corruption issues like that? So the graph that you see was one of the first pieces of information that was looking at, on the horizontal axis, was looking at the level of deviation of public expenditure in different areas and comparing that to a total level of spend. Now, the first finding from that is that you see a cluster near the intersection, which actually shows for the low spending budgetary units, actually the level of deviation was quite low. They were basically spending what they'd budgeted. But when you went down a further level and started looking at the outliers, you can see that the infrastructure programs, which were to a significant extent being funded by multilaterals, there is a significant level of deviation of the expenditure compared to what they're budgeted. And the total level of spend is very high. So that was of great concern to both the government and the multilateral, because the construction sector is a sector which is notoriously high risk from a corruption perspective. So then we started looking at some of the underlying projects to see what was going wrong. And actually the picture that emerged was more complex than there's just a corruption issue. One of the key issues that emerged was budgeting for these complex infrastructure projects needs capacity and expertise. You're budgeting for a hospital or a healthcare program. You need to make sure you've budgeted for the roads that are going to lead to that hospital, for the nurses and the doctors who are going to be in that, for the homes for those nurses and doctors. So what emerged was, when they were budgeting for this, they simply didn't have the expertise or the benchmark to develop a budget that was going to realistically correspond to what they would need to spend. So everyone accepted within government that really the budget wasn't the control for the expenditure. So there was always going to be this massive deviation. Now that created a situation whereby there was scope for corruption because the control mechanism wasn't working. But that was only part of what was happening. The fundamental problem was a lack of capacity to budget for these programs effectively. Then we started looking at some of the other areas. You see state utility subsidies. Well, this was an area where the expenditure was relatively low, but there was a massive deviation compared to the budget. And the picture that started emerging there was, because for some of the areas of high spend, the budget was losing credibility, actually it was losing credibility in some of the other areas as well. So it wasn't being used as a control as it should be in some of the other areas, including the state utilities. So you got this massive deviation. Then we started looking at, okay, let's look at a couple which are coming right on budget. If the budget is not being used as a control, how come in some areas things are coming right by budget? And there was a fund which is called the National Emergency Fund. And there was a trend that every year the total amount that was budgeted for emergencies was spent exactly to the dollar. Now that was odd in itself. If this is a budget for emergencies, how come it's being used up every year? So the picture that emerged from all of this was the budget directorate in country didn't have the capacity to develop a budget that had credibility and could be used as a control. Consequently, the only thing that the budget was really used to control was the total amount of expenditure. What it was actually spent on was spread across different categories. So the categories didn't necessarily reflect the expenditure that they were supposed to. And the outcome as a result of this exercise was a whole-scale program within the government to improve the capacity of the budget directorate so that in the longer term, the budget could really be used as a control against government expenditure, together with other controls being introduced in relation to high-risk areas like the infrastructure project, recognizing the budget is not really a control. So this was a very practical thing that the government did in conjunction with the multilateral to introduce some more robust controls around their public expenditure.
So out of curiosity,
Yeah.
when you're acting on behalf of the multilateral at this point, I take it?
So the key point about this was actually that the multilateral and the government came together because they had the same agenda. And this is very important. You have to have the same agenda, not just at the multilateral level, which is driving these anti-corruption activities, but for the government and private sector to be engaged in this. You cannot implement these sorts of programs if they're not mandated at the level of the Minister of Finance, at the level of the President. You simply cannot. So it was a program where the both had come together with the same objective.
And as a result of this sort of forensic inquiry,
Yes.
it does improve the behaviour of a government and the contractors it's employing. Is that what happens practically?
So that's the ultimate objective. Is actually this the point we were talking about earlier. This is about development effectiveness. The ultimate objective is spending public funds in a way that benefits the public in the country. There's a very broad governance agenda. What we were doing was breaking it down and identifying where is the money going, where is there scope for corruption and waste and inefficiency. So it's a broader agenda. And how do we need to control it? And ultimately, to your question, it should lead to a point where the controls are very tight. So you have a lot of transparency around, for example, how much money is spent on the infrastructure, how much was budgeted, what was the basis for this budget, so you can control any deviations. And you can control things like how the contracts were awarded and the monetary value of those contracts.
But in something of this nature, how
Yeah.
intricate would the network of people involved and the bodies involved in that transaction be, in that contract?
And that's very important, because actually, talked about the complexity. You have a network of suppliers who are involved in the contracting process. You have many stakeholders in government, the different departments, the Department of Health, the Department of Planning. So you have many stakeholders. You have many suppliers, but many stakeholders within government, as well as the multilaterals who provided the funding. So yes, you have lots of suppliers, but the broader point is you have many stakeholders who are demanding transparency over the expenditure, and ultimately the civil society demanding to know what the public funds have been spent on and how it's benefited them.
Steve, from your point of view, is this, for my benefit, is this kind of typical, this kind of the problem that we're faced with in multilateral banking with these developing countries?
Well, I think the problems you see in the developing countries are as broad as the imagination allows. This is not a surprising example at all. And we see, bank accounts as the diffusion of money through the banking system in a developing country is one that is ripe for corruption. I think Mariam's one of her early points of the importance of accountability as a mechanism to either allow for or critical to preventing corruption is really critical.
I was also tempted to ask that obviously there is theory and there is practice, isn't there? I mean,
Yeah.
Is business actually putting into practice the theory as quickly and as effectively as it should, do you think?
Well, I think the analogy of the governments who have the legislation on which has been passed, but are they implementing and enforcing? I think you can draw the same analogy for businesses who have the shiny policies and procedures in place. Are they actually implementing and enforcing and following that up? And I think it's the the questions to ask is, what are you actually doing in enforcing this? So for a government like this, they would say, we're really trying to create transparency around our budgeting process and our expenditure process so that we can tackle the problems. You can ask the same questions of business. A multinational business that's operating, in say 50 countries around the world, and they've got the anti-corruption policies and procedures in place. What are you doing to make sure that in the furthest corner of your business, the same principles are being applied, so you really truly have a global standard?
Yeah,
which
the
applies
key is to ensure that the incentives are there, everything
Yes.
on both sides. And the incentives are different, the goal is the same. In the private sector, I think one of the great challenges is to ensure that it really isn't just lip service, that there is actually an incentive to put in place a compliance program or an integrity program that should prevent this sort of conduct and make it stick. Year after year, we see examples of large multinational corporations who we think would be pillars of integrity. It turns out that they have significant problems. I mean, the most recent poster child for that is Siemens. Now, that example is a couple of years old, but I think no one ever imagined the web that a company like that would have in place. And they were working in jurisdictions where the incentives to enforce those shiny compliance programs and those very pretty integrity programs really took root. And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Same is true on the countryside. I think we have many countries that have very significant statutes. I was involved in a matter once where there were bribes were being paid to a government minister in Africa. There was involvement of the UK, involvement of the United States, involvement of a Nordic country. Ultimately, the African country had by far the most robust anti-corruption law, but had never enforced it. Truthfully, at the end of the day, none of the countries enforce their own statutes, so it's a challenge.
Arpinder, if I can bring you in, I mean, India historically has been a recipient of donor funding. I mean, do you see in India an impact of anti-corruption philosophy at the moment?
I think unfortunately India has been at the brunt of a lot of corruption issues in the last few weeks. So this is kind of, I think, quite a biased view because there have been so many media articles around bribery and corruption in India. But coming back to India specifically, I think as Steve correctly said, India has the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, which is supposed to be a local statute. How effective it is up in the air, because you rarely hear, for instance, of a company ever being taken to task. You hear of government officials, how long they spend in jail is again a question. They're planning to amend it and make it extraterritorial, go to foreign officials. There's some talk about that, which when it comes in would be interesting. But I think it's not been effective, my personal point of view, and I agree with Steve on that. But I think in India also it's changing. I think what's happening is that I think there's a lot of media advocacy and judicial advocacy. What I mean by that is media advocacy has got a lot of journalists, and unlike some other countries, I think there is no binding on them. I don't think they're afraid of, if they say something wrong or doesn't seem right, they'll go to jail or something. So I think there's a lot of media advocacy happening where something wrong happens and the media gets to know about it. It will come up and then some action will happen. There have been a lot of cases where, for instance, a simple thing like a rich person in a fancy car runs over a poor person. Normally in India, he would get away with it. You pay a little bit of money and you kind of get away with it. I think today the media would come in, take photographs, run programs, and the guy would go to jail. So I think media advocacy is, I think, a strong aspect in India which is changing. I think second is judicial advocacy, which means you have these PILs, which are basically public interest litigations, where normal citizens can actually go in, actually ask for certain pleadings, etc. And I think that's making, and I think the judges have become very, there are two aspects of judges. Some judges have been accused of bribery and corruption, while in other cases you have some senior judges in the Supreme Court, which in the recent 2-3 weeks have come out very aggressively against bribery and corruption, have actually gone and said, CBI, for instance, which is the local body which looks after the, like the FBI in the US, they've actually gone out and been very critical and saying, what the hell are you doing? I mean, why isn't this guy in jail? Or what are you up to? And I think we as citizens of India have been actually very impressed with the way the judges have come out so aggressively. And I think the government has tried to get the act together. Sonia Gandhi, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who are the leaders of the country, have actually come out with 5-point programs. Now I think it goes back to Steve's point. How effective the 5-point program will be in the next 6 months, 1 year is something which I hope as a citizen that it improves, but It's up to tell. But the unfortunate part is that the only people who lose out are the citizens, because if the infrastructure isn't there, there aren't roads. I mean, forget about rural areas. The roads in the urban areas aren't great. So I think, and it's supposed to be one of the growing countries. I have so many people who visit me from the US, UK. They always land in Mumbai, and they actually ask me, "Is this like the most high growth city?" And they always compare with China, or they compare with other cities of the world. But that's always the first question I get. That, are you saying that Mumbai is the richest city in India? And are you saying India is the 4th largest economy in the world? And are you saying that, so I think the perception is really bad, because they can't believe that infrastructure could be of a city which is supposed to be the center of India, financial capital, entertainment capital, Bollywood, and it doesn't have roads, and you can't go from point A to point B. You're landing and you'll see slums, there's no rehabilitation. Tourism is fairly negligible. So I would say right now the impression is pretty bad, but everybody's saying the right things, the judges, the politicians, and hopefully the wake-up call with all the scams now will move them towards the right direction. I think then hopefully in the next few years, I think you would see a resurgent India, where it's already resurgent, but hopefully you'll start seeing it where every common man enjoys the benefits of the prosperity, and it's not just the top few.
I was wondering though, when you have an economy growing as fast as India's, is that in some ways inevitably also a kind of a petri dish in which corruption can breed? Because it almost, the ethical behaviour is all well and good, but it can slow down that level of growth. I mean, when you have an economy sort of thriving that quickly, is it inevitably going to lead to corruption?
I think a country is like a corporate. A corporate which grows so fast every year after year, you're bound to have some bribery and corruption. You're going to have some fraud because of lack of controls. So India is no different. But I think the difference between India and other countries is that we are a democracy. So as a result, everything goes. And at the same time, I think people have been used to doing some level of bribery and corruption in the past, but the numbers were small. Now in the last 6 years, as India has grown so fast, suddenly the numbers are large. So everyone in the world talks about them because they matter. I mean, if you talk about the same bribery and corruption which happened 15 years back, you wouldn't talk in billions of dollars. Today you will talk in billions of dollars. So as a result, it suddenly becomes material, and the whole world starts looking at it. But I think, coming back to your point, I think what I've seen, because I've done work with multilaterals in not just India but in other countries across Asia, I find when I compare countries, India is a democracy where you will have corruption right from the bottom. Because the salaries are low, the public officials. I mean, at the end of the day, we can talk theory a lot, but the reality is if a public official is going to get 1/10 the salary of his peer who's staying in the same neighborhood, it's going to drive bribery and corruption. So till salary levels aren't fixed, you're going to perpetually have a problem. That's the reality. And at the same time, you got at the top, which is unstable. There's always some government upheaval. There'll be some party which has to be pleased, or there has to be some party which will threaten to break away. So as a result of that, you will always have a lot of bribery and corruption at the lower and middle levels, and obviously at the top also. But in some countries which I've seen across Asia, I won't mention names because Mariam will beat me up, but the reality is that you'll find it maybe only at the top, and not at because they're dictators, or they're people who are very centrally managed. There you may not find an India type situation, because at least I haven't. I found in countries like India, you'll find it right from the bottom to the top. There you might find it only at the top. And there's some other countries which are totally destable, which change every 6 months. There you'll find it only at the bottom, because you don't find it at the top because those guys don't have enough time to make the money. Before the time, you have to give the contract, the way kickbacks historically work, and I'm sure Steve may agree with me, you have to pay in advance, right? There has to be a cash transaction for a person to be paid off.
Just curious, in the context of the UK Act, which as we know comes into force on July the 1st, in somewhere like India, where facilitation payments are a way of life, aren't they? What would your advice be to British companies that are obliged or asked to pay one?
I would say that things are changing in India, I think for the better. And the reality is, a lot of corporates I talk to do say that you can do business without paying bribes. So every company doesn't say that, we have to pay bribes to do business. I was reading an article today in the newspaper which said, here are the list of 25 industries where you don't require licensing. Actually, there's no FDI, which is the foreign direct investment licensing required. So simple thing like that, so you don't require the first government interaction in the beginning to put money into the country. So that just shows that the country is moving towards less regulation, less complexity, so that companies can work in India without having to go to the government every time to get a license for every small thing, which reduces the bureaucracy or going to the bureaucrats. As a result, there are less middlemen, you get less burden. So that is interesting you asked, because I see that. Second is, I find at least countries in India, with the as I was mentioning earlier, with the media and judicial advocacy, I think people are both the government as well as the private, both sides are afraid that they're going to be exposed. So I think in India, as a culture as we are, we're very conscious of our shame. So no one wants to go to jail, no one wants to come in the media. So I think now that people are getting exposed and the government is doing the right thing by exposing them, everyone is petrified and doesn't want to pretty much do the wrong thing. Second is the regulators. I mean, if you take CBI, like Steve and I were chatting earlier, the reality is they're very good investigators. I mean, technically, I have a few people who have retired people from the CBI working for me, and I can tell you they're the best. I mean, if you talk about tracing money, like what Mariam was saying, they're really good. And, so I think the quality of investigations have improved, so they get to the bottom of it. It's not that they're not going to get to the bottom of it. I think another thing which has happened is the government is really trying. Let's take a simple thing. Mariam and Steve were earlier talking only about procurement. Procurement's the bigger risk, cost of construction. Technically in India, we've gone for a huge amount of e-procurement. That means there are different states which actually have e-procurement where, everything, all banking transactions are transparent, visible. We're moving towards where there's no cash or check payments and everything is done bank to bank. I mean, that's a big move. I mean, then how can you do bribery and corruption in a very easy way if everything is online, automated, etc.? I mean, one thing which really impresses me in India, for instance, is public-private partnership. Now, that's something which is changing the whole business model of multilateral funding, where rather than, let's take in the old days in India, there was something called the Public Works Department, PWD. So, if you want to build a road, you would go there and they would help you project manage it. Now you have private companies which are entering into public-private partnerships where the risk is going to the private companies to some extent. So as a result, they're going towards different models, because is the government meant to project manage road projects, for instance? I mean, I think the private companies will be better at managing the projects. So if both public and private have a partnership. So there's so many new things happening, which I think in the future will reduce the bribery and corruption, will allow companies, like you asked me about British companies, going back to your specific question, British companies in India should stop feeling afraid that they can't do business in India without paying a bribe. And I think all the government ministers are trying to go to different countries of the world to convince them that India is not a bad place. You can invest, you can do business. I was in the plane today coming to London, and I found so many ministers coming here. Obviously, they're coming for seminars, trying to tell people, give them comfort that you can come, you won't be harassed. So I think there's a lot of evangelism happening in the country where we're trying to make ourselves a better destination. And I think if countries are proud and they want money, they will have to follow the right rules. If for instance, we want better infrastructure and we want a loan from World Bank, I think we need to demonstrate that there is no bribery and corruption. If we want British companies to invest in India and they shouldn't be afraid of UK Bribery Act, we have to tell them that yes, you can come to do business in India and not be afraid of like the whole Commonwealth game thing, where so many British or Australian companies are stuck with so much outstanding. I think hopefully if the government should resolve that issue, either way, rather than leaving it in the middle, so that companies which have done work in the CWG are paid off in that way. So I think it is improving. I mean, look at the fact that the Prevention of Corruption Act in India, which has been there for so many years, I mean, that's going to be revised and cover foreign officials who may have bribed for getting work in India. I mean, that's the extent of where they're going. They're also talking about a whistleblower bill, which will potentially help in people blowing the whistle. The companies bill is supposed to be changed, where they'll also make it mandatory for some listed companies. It's recommendatory right now to have hotlines in India, and that was never there. I mean, in the country. I mean, we had a clause 49 thing which was very similar to Sarbanes-Oxley, which talked about listed companies having all sorts of things. I think the area which I actually find interesting is again the whole debate around the public-private, because I know multilaterals like World Bank, and I would love Steve's comment on that actually, is I think the public side, a lot of work happens, investigations, reviews, but I'm sure you guys have a private side too, where you invest through the private sector to do good in a particular country. I would love your perspective. Do you think we've become very mature on the public side, while on the private side it's new and growing? And do we let them be like private equities, or do we actually put in the same amount of governance on the private side as we do on the public side? Even though tomorrow the private side may become larger than the public, but it's just much easier to fund companies which are doing the right thing. I would love your view on that, actually.
Well, it's an interesting challenge. I mean, in the context of multilateral development banks, there's a bit of a distinction between the two that I think it's a gap that we're closing. There's actually the issue of integrity and integrity due diligence, as Marianne mentioned, has existed on the private side for a good bit of time, in part because of legislation in some of the leading economies like the UK and the United States. In the United States, for example, private businesses have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's because of the need to comply with the FCPA and Sarbanes-Oxley that there's been an increased focus by private companies on integrity and in integrity due diligence. As we were discussing earlier, I think at the end of the day, one of the greatest incentives on the private side is, well, how is this going to affect the bottom line of my business? If I can make a larger profit, that's good. If I pay fewer bribes, I will make a larger profit, therefore I'm in a better position. On the other hand, that's tempered by the notion that, will I not get the business unless I pay the bribe in a particular jurisdiction? Which is why comments like yours that says, I think a company can come to India now and win the contract without paying a bribe is so absolutely critical. That's really what we're hoping for at the World Bank. What we want to do is create a level playing field so that all the companies believe that they can win the contract without paying the bribe. I think one of the challenge for the private companies is they are not yet convinced of that in many places, and no one wants to be first. No one wants to be the company to say, okay, I'm not going to pay bribes because they risk losing the business. One thing we've created to address this situation within the World Bank is a voluntary disclosure program, where we actually encourage companies that have found out or want to acknowledge that they've engaged in fraud or corruption previously, but are prepared to stop paying the bribes, to come forward, let the World Bank know. We're anxious to, at a minimum, get the information so we can take steps to work with the local governments to make sure that the problems don't reoccur and that their colleagues, their competitors, are not paying the bribes as well. And in exchange, the company will essentially be free, will not be sanctioned, and will not receive a penalty that they might achieve otherwise. So it's very important to create those incentives for the private side as well. The World Bank and all the multilateral banks have put an increased amount of attention into integrity due diligence on their private sector lending activities that's much more akin to what the private sector firms have been doing really outside of the multilateral development bank for a number of years now. So it is an area of an enormous importance, because you have to have a focus both on the supply side and on the demand side when you're fighting corruption. And if you look at one without looking at the other, the problem is not going to be solved. We're not going to make the kind of progress that we need to make.
Steve, another very minute problem. Do you feel when you're lending, is a centralized model, if a government has a centralized or a decentralized model, have you got a point of view on that from a bribery?
Yeah, the risks are there in either case. I know at the World Bank there's been a tremendous amount, in all the multilaterals, there's been pressure to decentralize. From a development perspective, decentralization makes a lot of sense. It's cheaper. It really improves the governance, or it allows governance to take root through the development of the project. Better to let the community develop its own ability to execute a project rather than let all the work be done in the capital. Have the knowledge spread out throughout the country. But there are times when that creates an increased corruption risk. We had an interesting case a couple of years ago at the World Bank where we had decentralized a road project in a particular country in Latin America. And we had asked each individual community to select the winning bidder to build the leg of road that would connect their community to the next community. So it was a road project, but it was a number of, by multilateral standards, very small contracts in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, really small by our standards. We ended up getting some allegations. We went in and we conducted initially a forensic audit and ultimately an investigation, and we had determined that it was fraught with corruption. And what had happened is each of the communities had developed a committee to select the winning bidder. We went and we interviewed the bid selection committees, and we said, well, didn't you follow the World Bank's procurement rules? And he said, there's a book this high, tells you exactly how to do this. And he goes, well, no, we only had one copy, and it was in English, and we didn't read English. And they said, well, it was online, so we don't have a computer, so we didn't read there either. And said, well, then how did you go about picking the winning bidder? And said, well, we did what we always did for important decisions. We asked the mayor, and the mayor told us who to pick. And then when we went and spoke to the company, we said, well, how is it that you got picked? We said, well, we did it like we always did. We made a very significant donation to the mayor's political party and then made a payment to the mayor. And then we went to the losing bidders. We asked them for copies of their letterhead and filled out fake bids. And so you, World Bank, why are you complaining? The road got built. And you had 3 bids, just like you insisted. So there, that was an example where the decentralization model failed completely on the corruption front. I think it can work, but again, you've got to put in place, as Miriam said, the right accountability, the right transparency, and really some of this is simply capacity building, making sure that people understand how to move the project forward while at the same time taking into account the integrity risks.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a couple of points. The point that you made about integrity due diligence is absolutely right. 10 years ago when we were working on mergers and acquisitions for clients, it was all about the financial due diligence. And now the integrity due diligence, who they're doing business with, how the contracts have been obtained is a key part of the due diligence process. And on the point earlier about facilitation payments and kind of looking more into the future, we see more and more businesses coming together under this banner of kind of collective action. How do you really change things on the ground? And I think a really good example of that was logistics companies that came together under the leadership of TNT and others in Vietnam. And they had this enormous problem that you had to make payments to customs officials as you took imports into the country. And so what they did is they worked with the government, and it took, as a business, as a whole sector, and it took a couple of years. And the outcome of that program was the government increasing the salary of customs officials up in this point. When the salaries are low, it breeds corruption. The government increased the salary. They fundamentally changed the tax structure, so the businesses were paying more tax, but they weren't confronted with this demand for corruption. And ultimately, as a sector, as a business, as a collection of businesses, they worked with government to fund an academy for customs officials to give them further training and development. So we see more looking into the future. We see more and more of these models of collective action, which take a long time to pull together, but are increasingly effective.
Interestingly enough, as you say, looking to the future, I mean, in perhaps a typically British way, the Bribery Act has raised a certain amount of doom and gloom and despondency in certain quarters. I mean, overall, as we move forward against bribery and corruption, are you an optimist?
Well, see, from where I sit, I mean, the new Bribery Act isn't doom and gloom, it's optimism. It shows that the UK is taking the issue seriously. It wasn't until, I think, 2002 that it was a crime in the UK to pay a bribe to a foreign government official, I think, as Marianne alluded to. Even that's in the UK. I think if you tell someone outside the UK that was the case, they'd be shocked. So I see the Bribery Act as actually a real opportunity to increase the accountability of firms. These laws do not mean that every company operating in the UK is going to be prosecuted for corruption. What I think it will do is it will change the incentive structure. If a firm should take another look at their business and make sure that they are acting in a manner of the highest integrity overseas, and the statute, as will hopefully ultimately be enforced and explained through court decisions and the like, will create a structure for them to understand how to do that. So I actually see it as an opportunity. Sometimes businesses need a little push, they need a little nudge, a little bit of an incentive to push it forward and connect the notion and sort of the moral view of more integrity with the more traditional corporate view of ensuring that the company is as profitable as it can be. You have to sometimes help them build the bridge between the two.
And Mariam, would your view be going forward that businesses are very wise to do some kind of integrity audit and and tackle this right now, in one sense spurred on by the fact that we have a new act?
Well, in fact, what we're finding is that many of the multinationals, especially with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other legislation, and frankly, companies that had the right corporate culture had started this a long time ago. So yes, this is an ongoing change. So I too am an optimist, and I'll take another example, another sort of angle of why I'm an optimist. For the first time in the UK, now we have police forces, which have 2 units in the City of Met Police Force, which are funded by aid funding by the Department for International Development, whose sole objective is to investigate and trace the flow of funds from developing countries to the UK where there are proceeds of corruption. And you see the effect of that already with the prosecution of one of the previous associates of a Nigerian mayor, and the recovery of about £15 million of funds, and the return of that to the Nigerian public purse. So the combination of increased legislation and hopefully the proper enforcement of that, and also the pursuing of the individuals who are benefiting from this corruption, I think are both positive signs.
And Arpinder, final word from you?
I would just say, I want to pick up what Steve started with. He actually said, that what World Bank does in investigation is not really reactive, but actually proactive, because it's a deterrent. I would like to support that by saying that I've been on the recipient side because, not because EY did anything, but because I was supporting a company which had been accused by World Bank to do something wrong. So they wanted, the parent wanted to know that is their local operations did they actually do the wrong which World Bank claims they've done? And that just showed there was huge fear to be on the blacklist of world banks globally. So as a result, it was a deterrent because they cleaned shop to such an extent because they were paranoid and afraid to be on that blacklist of World Bank. So it just shows that it is a deterrent because it was just one local country, but they were operating in 140 countries. So they cleaned shop in 140 countries based on action in one country.
Glad to see it's working.
Nice to end on a trio of optimists, and I'd like to thank Steve, Mariam, Arpinder, and of course you for watching. Thanks very much.